Late afternoon, December 1925. Inside London's most exclusive department store, Selfridge's on Oxford Street, a group of elegantly dressed women glide through the aisles like they own the place. They're wearing expensive furs, designer hats, and jewelry that sparkles under the electric lights. Shop assistants smile and bow, assuming these are wealthy society ladies with money to burn. What they don't realize is that beneath those luxurious coats are specially sewn pockets large enough to hide entire bolts of silk. Under those wide-brimmed hats are compartments for stolen jewelry. And leading this operation, coordinating every movement with military precision, is a tall, imposing woman with rings on every finger. Massive diamond rings that aren't just for show, but are designed as weapons. Her name is Alice Diamond, and she's the undisputed queen of London's most successful all-female crime gang, the 40 Elephants. Within 30 minutes, these women will walk out of Selfridge's with thousands of pounds worth of merchandise hidden beneath their clothes, and the store won't realize they've been robbed until inventory is taken days later. But here's what makes Alice Diamond's story extraordinary. She wasn't just a criminal. She was a woman who built a criminal empire in an era when women couldn't vote, couldn't own property in their own names, and were expected to be silent and obedient. She commanded absolute loyalty from dozens of women, terrified male gangsters who tried to challenge her authority, and created an organization so sophisticated that it operated successfully for decades. This is the story of the Diamond Queen, the woman with iron fists hidden in silk gloves, and how a girl from London's poorest slums became the most feared female gangster in British history. Alice Diamond was born in 1896 in Southwark, one of London's most notorious slum districts, into a world where poverty wasn't just uncomfortable, it was brutal, grinding, and often deadly. Understanding Alice requires understanding the London she grew up in, because her story only makes sense within the context of a city where the gap between rich and poor was so vast that they might as well have lived on different planets, and where survival for working-class families meant making choices that respectable society would never have to contemplate. Southwark sat just south of the Thames River, in the shadow of London Bridge, close enough to see the wealth and grandeur of the City of London, but separated by geography and by class barriers that were nearly impossible to cross. The streets were narrow, crowded, filthy, open sewers ran through some areas, and the smell of poverty, of too many people living in too little space, of inadequate sanitation and desperate circumstances, hung over everything. Most buildings were overcrowded tenements, where entire families lived in single rooms, where disease spread easily, where infant mortality rates were shocking even by Victorian standards. Alice's father had a criminal record. He'd been in and out of prison for various offences, which was common among Southwark men who couldn't find legitimate work or who found that crime paid better than the back-breaking labour that was the only alternative. Her mother struggled to feed Alice and her 7 siblings on whatever money came in, which was never enough. This wasn't a household with books or education or opportunities. It was a household where survival was the daily concern, where children learned early that the world was harsh and that you had to be tougher than your circumstances if you wanted to live. Alice was different from her siblings in ways that became obvious early. She was tall, unusually tall for a girl of her time and class, eventually reaching nearly 6 feet, which made her tower over most men and virtually all women. This height could have made her awkward or self-conscious, but Alice apparently embraced it, recognizing that physical presence was power in a world where power usually belonged to men simply because they were larger and stronger. She was also naturally athletic, strong, with a build that was solid rather than delicate, muscular rather than fragile. In Southwark's brutal environment, these physical attributes weren't disadvantages, but assets. Alice could fight, and she learned to fight well, because fighting was how you protected yourself, how you defended your siblings, how you earned respect in a neighborhood where weakness invited victimization. She wasn't ladylike in the way that respectable Victorian society expected girls to be, demure, passive, ornamental. She was aggressive, direct, physical. She understood that in her world, respect came through strength, and she cultivated strength deliberately. Her education was minimal. Most working-class children in late Victorian London received only the most basic schooling, and many received none at all. Alice probably attended a board school for a few years, learning just enough reading and arithmetic to be functionally literate, but nothing that would open doors to middle-class occupations. For girls of her class, the expected life paths were narrow: domestic service, factory work, prostitution, or early marriage followed by endless childbearing and likely early death from the physical toll of poverty and repeated pregnancies. Alice rejected all of these paths. She was perhaps 12 or 13 when she committed her first documented theft, stealing from market stalls, from shops, from wherever opportunity presented itself. This wasn't unusual in Southwark, where petty theft was so common that police couldn't possibly pursue every case. But Alice was apparently better at it than most children, more strategic, more careful, showing even then the intelligence and planning ability that would later characterize her criminal career. The money she stole helped feed her siblings, supplemented the household income, allowed her family to survive when legitimate earnings weren't enough. This created a justification that Alice probably used to rationalize her crimes. She wasn't stealing for luxury or greed, but for survival, for family, for the people who depended on her. Whether this justification was sincere or convenient, it allowed her to continue developing skills that would eventually make her one of London's most successful criminals. The nickname Diamond came later, and its origins reveal something about Alice's personality and her strategic thinking. The diamond is the hardest natural substance, impossible to scratch, capable of cutting through anything else. Alice chose this identity deliberately. She wanted to be perceived as hard, unbreakable, sharp, dangerous. The diamond imagery also connected to wealth and luxury, to the world of the rich that Southwark's residents could see but never access through legitimate means. By calling herself Diamond, Alice was claiming those associations, was insisting that she deserved the luxury and respect that society denied to people of her class. By her late teens, Alice was operating in London's criminal underworld with increasing sophistication. She'd moved beyond simple opportunistic theft to more planned operations, more strategic targeting of wealthy victims. She'd also begun building a reputation for toughness that would become crucial to her later success. In the male-dominated world of early 20th century crime, a woman had to be exponentially tougher than men to be taken seriously, had to demonstrate that she couldn't be intimidated or controlled, had to prove that challenging her would be more costly than accepting her. Alice apparently embraced violence as a tool for establishing dominance. She got into fights, with other women, sometimes with men, and she won. She developed a fighting style that used her height and strength advantages, that was brutal and direct, that left opponents injured enough to remember not to challenge her again. This willingness to use violence wasn't psychopathic or sadistic, but strategic. Alice understood that in her world, reputation for toughness was valuable, that being known as someone who would fight and who would win meant that most potential conflicts could be avoided because people wouldn't dare challenge her. The diamond rings that would become her trademark started appearing during this period. Alice wore multiple rings on each hand, large, flashy rings with prominent stones that announced wealth and status. But these weren't purely ornamental. The rings were essentially brass knuckles disguised as jewelry. The large stone settings added weight and hardness that made her punches devastating. When Alice hit someone while wearing her diamond rings, she wasn't just punching, but was striking with what amounted to a weapon, capable of breaking bones and causing serious injuries. This weaponization of jewelry demonstrated Alice's characteristic cleverness. She'd found a way to carry weapons that were completely legal, that actually enhanced her feminine appearance rather than compromising it, that allowed her to be both glamorous and dangerous simultaneously. Men could carry brass knuckles or cautious, but those were obviously weapons that would attract police attention. Alice's diamond rings accomplished the same purpose while appearing to be nothing more than a woman's vanity. By her early 20s, Alice had established herself in Southwark's criminal community as someone formidable, someone to respect or fear, someone who was going places. She'd survived circumstances that killed or broke most people, had developed skills and reputation that would open opportunities in the criminal underworld, had positioned herself to take advantage of those opportunities when they arose. She wasn't content with petty theft or with the limited criminal careers available to most women of her class. She had ambitions. Ambitions that seemed ridiculous for a woman from Southwark, but that Alice believed she could achieve through intelligence, toughness, and absolute refusal to accept limitations. The opportunity she was waiting for came through the 40 Elephants, an all-female shoplifting gang that had operated in South London for decades, but that needed new leadership, new energy, new strategic thinking. When Alice encountered this gang in her early 20s, she recognized that here was the vehicle through which she could build something extraordinary. Not just a criminal enterprise, but an empire. Not just a way to steal for survival, but a way to command, to dominate, to live the kind of life that respectable society insisted people like her could never have. The girl from Southwark was about to become the queen of London's criminal underworld. And she was about to prove that the most dangerous thing in London wasn't a man with a gun, but a woman with diamonds on her fingers and ice in her veins. The 40 Elephants gang that Alice Diamond joined in her early 20s wasn't new. It had existed in various forms since at least the 1870s, operating as the female auxiliary of the Elephant and Castle Boys, a male criminal gang that controlled territory in South London. Understanding the 40 Elephants' history and structure helps explain both why the organization appealed to Alice and how she was able to transform it from a loose collection of shoplifters into one of London's most sophisticated criminal operations. The name 40 Elephants came from the gang's base in Elephant and Castle, a district in Southwark named after a pub that had stood there for centuries. The area was solidly working class, notorious for crime and poverty, a place where police ventured cautiously and where criminal gangs operated with relative impunity as long as they didn't attract too much official attention. The 40 in the name apparently referred to the approximate number of active members, though this fluctuated, sometimes more, sometimes fewer, but consistently large enough to be a significant presence in London's criminal ecology. What made the 40 Elephants unusual wasn't just that they were all women, but that they operated with remarkable independence from their male counterparts. While technically affiliated with the Elephant and Castle Boys, and while they paid tribute to male gang leaders as protection money, ensuring they wouldn't be interfered with, the 40 Elephants ran their own operations, made their own decisions about targets and tactics, and maintained their own internal hierarchy. This autonomy was rare in early 20th century criminal organizations, which were usually male-dominated, with women serving only as girlfriends, accomplices, or sex workers, rather than as independent operators. The gang specialized in shoplifting, what they called hoisting, targeting London's growing number of department stores and luxury shops. This specialization made strategic sense for several reasons. Department stores were relatively new commercial institutions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and their security systems hadn't yet adapted to the sophisticated theft techniques that professional criminals were developing. The stores displayed merchandise openly, encouraging customers to touch and examine goods, which created opportunities for theft that didn't exist in older-style shops, where merchants kept most items behind counters. And perhaps most importantly, well-dressed women could enter these spaces without attracting suspicion. Society expected wealthy women to shop, so female thieves who dressed appropriately could blend in perfectly with legitimate customers. When Alice joined the 40 Elephants, the gang was competent but not exceptional. They made decent money from shoplifting, but operated without the strategic coordination and aggressive expansion that characterized truly successful criminal enterprises. Leadership was unclear or contested, discipline was inconsistent, and individual members sometimes competed with each other rather than cooperating for collective benefit. Alice recognized immediately that the organization had enormous untapped potential that better leadership could unlock. Her rise to leadership happened relatively quickly, probably within 2 or 3 years of joining. The specific mechanisms aren't clearly documented. Alice left no memoir, and contemporary news coverage of female criminals focused more on sensationalizing their crimes than on analyzing organizational dynamics. But we can infer from later events that Alice's ascent came through some combination of demonstrated success in planning and executing thefts, willingness to use violence to enforce her authority, and ability to articulate a vision that appealed to other gang members who recognized that Alice offered them opportunities they wouldn't have under the existing leadership. By around 1916 or 1917, when Alice was in her early 20s, she'd become the recognized queen of the 40 Elephants, the final authority on all significant decisions, the person who planned major operations, the enforcer of discipline, the public face of the organization, insofar as it had one. This position gave her power that was extraordinary for any woman of her era and class. She commanded dozens of women, controlled significant financial resources, determined strategy for a substantial criminal enterprise, and exercised life-or-death authority over her subordinates in the sense that betraying the gang meant facing Alice's violent retaliation. Alice's first major innovation was professionalizing the gang's operations. Under her leadership, the 40 Elephants transformed from opportunistic thieves who stole whatever they could whenever they could into a disciplined organization, operating according to carefully planned strategies. Alice insisted on reconnaissance before major operations. Gang members would visit target stores multiple times, noting security arrangements, identifying valuable merchandise, timing the movements of shop assistants and security guards, mapping out escape routes. This preparation meant that when the actual theft occurred, every participant knew exactly what to do, exactly where to go, exactly how to maximize the take while minimizing risk. She also standardized the techniques that gang members used. Alice personally trained new recruits, teaching them how to dress to look wealthy, how to move through stores confidently as though they belonged there, how to distract shop assistants while accomplices stole merchandise, how to conceal stolen goods in specially modified clothing. This training created consistency. Any 40 Elephants member could be inserted into any operation and would know exactly how to perform her role. It also created quality control. Alice wouldn't allow women into the gang unless they could demonstrate competence in the required skills, which meant the organization's overall performance improved as less capable members were excluded. The clothing that 40 Elephants members wore during operations became increasingly sophisticated under Alice's direction. They wore expensive-looking coats with large interior pockets owned by gang members who had dressmaking skills. They wore wide skirts that could conceal merchandise strapped to their legs. They used large handbags with false bottoms. They wore voluminous bloomers, a relatively new style of women's underwear that could hold surprising amounts of stolen fabric or small items. The goal was to create a moving warehouse that could walk out of stores carrying thousands of pounds worth of merchandise, while appearing to carry nothing at all. Alice also introduced what we might now call operational security. She established rules about what gang members could and couldn't discuss outside the organization, about who could know details of planned operations, about how to handle police interrogation if arrested. The penalty for breaking these rules was severe. Alice would personally assault women who violated security protocols, using her diamond rings to inflict injuries that served as warnings to others. This violence was strategic rather than sadistic. Alice needed absolute reliability from her gang members because one informant could destroy the entire organization, so she made the cost of betrayal higher than any benefit that cooperation with police might offer. The gang's internal structure became more hierarchical and organized under Alice's leadership. She divided members into different roles based on their strengths. Some women were fronts. Their job was to engage shop assistants in conversation, asking questions about merchandise, creating distractions that allowed others to steal. Some were hoists, the actual thieves who took merchandise while fronts provided cover. Some were carriers. Their clothing was specially modified to carry the most goods, so after hoists stole items, they'd quickly pass them to carriers who could conceal larger quantities. Some women specialized in particular types of theft: jewelry, furs, silks, developing expertise that made them exceptionally effective at stealing those specific items. Alice created a financial system that was surprisingly sophisticated for a criminal gang. Instead of allowing members to simply keep whatever they stole and sell it themselves, which would create competition and resentment, Alice required that all stolen goods be turned over to her or to trusted lieutenants. The merchandise would then be sold through fences, merchants who knowingly bought stolen goods and resold them, and the proceeds would be divided according to a formula that rewarded skill and seniority. Alice took the largest cut, as the leader who planned operations and who provided protection and coordination. Experienced members received more than newer recruits. Women who'd taken the greatest risks during operations received bonuses. This system ensured that everyone benefited from the gang's success while maintaining Alice's control over finances. By the early 1920s, the 40 Elephants, under Alice Diamond's leadership, had become the most successful shoplifting organization in London and possibly in all of Britain. They were stealing hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of merchandise annually, operating in stores throughout London and increasingly in other cities, employing tactics that frustrated police and store security forces who couldn't figure out how women could walk out of stores with so much merchandise without being detected. Alice had transformed a scrappy South London gang into a criminal enterprise that operated with the efficiency and sophistication of a business corporation. She'd proven that women could organize, could strategize, could execute complex criminal operations as effectively as men, more effectively actually, because society's assumptions about feminine weakness and respectability created blind spots that female criminals could exploit. But success brought challenges that would test even Alice's formidable abilities. The gang's very effectiveness was making them a priority target for police. Their growing wealth and visibility were creating jealousy among male criminals who resented women operating so successfully in what they considered male territory. And internal dynamics within the gang were becoming more complicated, as success brought money and status that some members wanted to control for themselves. Alice had built an empire. Now she had to defend it against enemies both outside and inside her organization. The Queen of the 40 Elephants was about to face the greatest challenges of her criminal career. Understanding how the 40 Elephants actually conducted their thefts under Alice Diamond's leadership requires us to look beyond romantic notions of daring robberies to examine the meticulous planning, sophisticated techniques, and psychological manipulation that made their operation successful. What Alice created wasn't just a criminal gang, but a precision instrument designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in early 20th century retail security, in social expectations about women's behavior, and in the limitations of police investigative techniques of that era. The typical 40 Elephants operation began weeks before any actual theft occurred. Alice, or her senior lieutenants, would identify a target, usually a high-end department store in London's West End shopping district, places like Selfridges, Harrods, Swan and Edgar, or Liberty. These stores catered to wealthy customers and stocked expensive merchandise. Silk fabrics worth several pounds per yard, fur coats costing hundreds of pounds, jewelry, designer clothing, luxury goods that could be resold quickly through the gang's network of fences. The stores were also relatively new commercial institutions that emphasized customer service and open display of merchandise, creating vulnerabilities that traditional shops with their counter-service models didn't have. Once a target was selected, reconnaissance began. Gang members would visit the store as apparent customers, studying the layout, noting where the most valuable merchandise was displayed, observing security arrangements, timing how long it took staff to respond to customer requests, identifying blind spots where actions wouldn't be easily observed. They'd visit at different times of day to understand when the store was most crowded. Crowding provided cover for theft, and when staff were most distracted. They'd identify all exits and escape routes, including service entrances and connections to adjacent buildings that might provide alternative ways out if main exits were blocked. This reconnaissance phase demonstrated Alice's strategic thinking. Many criminals operated impulsively, seeing an opportunity and acting on it without preparation. Alice insisted on information gathering that would minimize risk and maximize success probability. She wanted her gang members to know target stores as well as the store's own employees did, to understand every vulnerability, to be able to adapt if circumstances during the actual theft didn't match expectations. This preparation turned theft from gambling into calculated risk-taking, where the odds favored the gang. The gang members who would conduct the actual theft prepared carefully. They bathed and groomed themselves meticulously. Working-class women in early 20th century London didn't always have access to regular bathing, but Alice insisted that her gang members be clean and well-groomed, because wealthy women were expected to be. They dressed in expensive-looking clothing that was often itself stolen from previous operations, creating a circular system where stolen clothes enabled further theft. The clothing wasn't just about appearance, but was functionally designed for concealment. The modifications to clothing were ingenious. Coats and jackets had enormous interior pockets sewn along the lining, capable of holding bolts of fabric, multiple garments, or substantial quantities of small, valuable items. Skirts were designed with hidden compartments and straps on the inside where merchandise could be secured. The large, fashionable hats that women wore in this era weren't just style choices, but functional. Their wide brims could conceal jewelry or small items, and their interior spaces could be modified to hold stolen goods. Even undergarments became tools. The bloomers and petticoats that women wore had pockets sewn in, creating layers of concealment that made detection nearly impossible without strip searches that police were reluctant to conduct on women in public. The operation itself followed a carefully choreographed plan that Alice had devised and that gang members had rehearsed. A typical operation involved 3 or 4 women working as a coordinated team, each with a specific role. The front would approach a shop assistant, engaging them in conversation about merchandise, asking detailed questions about fabrics or styles or prices, requesting that items be brought out for inspection. While the assistant was focused on the front, providing the high-quality customer service that department stores prided themselves on, the hoister would be working nearby, quickly and efficiently removing merchandise from displays and concealing it in her modified clothing. The speed and efficiency were remarkable. An experienced 40 Elephants hoister could remove a silk scarf from a display, fold it, and conceal it in an interior pocket in perhaps 5 or 6 seconds. Faster than most people could consciously process what they were seeing, even if they were looking directly at her. Multiple items could be taken in the time a shop assistant spent showing a single item to a customer. The gang members' movements were smooth and natural, nothing furtive or suspicious that would attract attention. They looked like wealthy women shopping, which was exactly what they were supposed to look like. If the operation involved particularly valuable items or larger quantities of merchandise, additional gang members might be present as lookouts, watching for security guards or store detectives, ready to create diversions if needed. Diversions could be as simple as one woman pretending to faint, causing staff to rush to help her while Confederates stole freely during the distraction, or as complex as staging an argument between supposed customers that drew everyone's attention away from where the actual theft was occurring. These psychological manipulations exploited social conventions about how people were expected to respond to emergencies or conflicts, turning those conventions into vulnerabilities. The gang members would leave the store separately, not together, avoiding any appearance of association that might make security staff suspicious. They'd have planned meeting points away from the store where they'd rendezvous and where stolen goods would be transferred to carriers, gang members whose clothing was specially modified to carry maximum loads, but who hadn't been inside the target store and therefore couldn't be connected to the theft if the operation was discovered before everyone got away. This separation of roles created layers of protection. Even if one person was caught, she couldn't compromise everyone else because she didn't know all the participants or all the details of the operation. The timing of operations was strategic. Alice preferred to strike when stores were busiest, Saturday afternoons, the weeks before Christmas, during sales when crowds were largest and when staff were most overwhelmed. The chaos of crowds provided perfect cover for theft. She also understood seasonal opportunities. Fur coats could be stolen most profitably in autumn when stores stocked up for winter, silk and fabric during spring for summer fashion. This seasonal approach maximized the value of what was stolen while taking advantage of when stores were most vulnerable. After successful operations, the gang would typically celebrate. Alice believed in rewarding success, partly to maintain morale and loyalty, partly because she genuinely enjoyed the lifestyle that criminal success enabled. The gang would sometimes rent expensive hotel rooms, would hire cars and drivers, would go to restaurants and clubs that working-class women would never normally access. This wasn't just celebration, but was also a form of class warfare. Alice and her gang were demonstrating that they could live like the wealthy, could access spaces and experiences that society insisted were only for their betters, could achieve through crime what legitimate society denied them through class barriers. But Alice never allowed celebrations to compromise security. Gang members were forbidden from discussing operations in public, from showing off stolen goods that might identify them, from behaviors that would attract police attention. The balance between enjoying success and maintaining operational security was delicate, and Alice enforced it through both rewards and punishments. Women who followed the rules received larger shares of proceeds, received protection from police, received the respect and sisterhood that gang membership provided. Women who violated rules faced Alice's direct and violent retribution. She would beat them herself, using her diamond rings to inflict injuries that left permanent scars as warnings to others. The sophistication of the 40 Elephants operations under Alice's leadership was remarkable for any criminal organization, but especially remarkable for one run entirely by women in an era when women were considered intellectually inferior to men, incapable of the strategic thinking that complex operations required. Alice had proven these assumptions completely false. Her gang operated with discipline and efficiency that many male criminal organizations couldn't match. They stole more, got caught less frequently, and maintained security more effectively than most of their male counterparts. This success demonstrated something that society was reluctant to acknowledge: that women's supposed intellectual and organizational limitations were socially constructed rather than biologically determined. That given opportunity and motivation, women could excel at any activity, including criminal enterprise. The art of the heist, as Alice Diamond perfected it, wasn't really about the physical act of theft. That was straightforward enough. It was about understanding psychology, about exploiting social expectations, about planning and preparation and coordination, about managing people and information and risk. It was, in its own criminal way, a remarkable demonstration of feminine capability, operating in a sphere that society insisted women couldn't and shouldn't enter. Alice had built a machine for extracting wealth from London's retail economy, and she'd done it so effectively that the machine would continue operating, with various modifications, for decades. The art she'd perfected would inspire and guide female criminals long after she was gone, would demonstrate that the supposed glass ceiling limiting women's capabilities was just another barrier that the right woman, with the right combination of intelligence and ruthlessness, could shatter completely. Alice Diamond's reputation as the Queen of Thieves rested not just on her success at organizing shoplifting operations, but on her willingness and ability to use violence to maintain authority and protect her territory. Understanding this violent dimension of her character is crucial because it reveals how women in early 20th century criminal underworlds had to operate differently from men to achieve and maintain power. And because it demonstrates the particular calculations that Alice made about when violence was necessary and how it should be deployed for maximum effectiveness. In the male-dominated criminal world of early 20th century London, physical toughness was currency. Men established dominance through fighting, maintained authority through the credible threat of violence, resolved disputes through physical confrontation. For a woman to command respect and obedience in this environment required proving that she was as tough as any man. Actually, tougher. Because society's expectations about feminine weakness meant that a woman had to exceed male standards of toughness to be taken seriously. Alice understood this dynamic instinctively and shaped her public persona accordingly. The diamond rings that gave Alice her nickname were central to this violent reputation. She wore multiple rings on each hand. Accounts vary, but suggest somewhere between 4 and 8 rings total, all large, all with prominent stone settings that added considerable weight and hardness to her fists. When Alice punched someone while wearing these rings, she wasn't delivering an ordinary punch, but was striking with what amounted to brass knuckles, capable of breaking facial bones, splitting skin, causing injuries that required medical treatment and that left permanent scars. Alice apparently wore these rings constantly, not just during confrontations, but as part of her everyday appearance. This constant display served multiple purposes. Obviously, the rings were beautiful and expensive-looking, advertising wealth and success, demonstrating that Alice had achieved the kind of affluence that working-class women weren't supposed to attain. But they were also implicit threats. Everyone who knew Alice understood that those beautiful rings were weapons, that getting into conflict with her meant facing those rings, that the jewelry on her hands could and would be used to inflict serious harm. The rings transformed Alice's body into a weapon that she carried everywhere, legally, visibly, intimidatingly. Contemporary accounts describe Alice as being quick to use violence when she felt challenged or disrespected. These weren't random outbursts of rage, but were calculated demonstrations of power, designed to maintain her authority and to discourage others from challenging her. When a gang member violated rules, perhaps discussing operations too freely, perhaps keeping stolen goods for herself rather than turning them over to be fenced collectively, perhaps showing insufficient respect to Alice or to senior gang members, Alice would personally administer punishment. She'd beat the offending woman, often in front of other gang members, using her rings to inflict painful and visible injuries that served as warnings to everyone watching. This public violence wasn't sadism, but management technique. Alice needed her gang members to fear the consequences of betrayal or disobedience more than they feared police or prison. Legal punishment was uncertain and delayed. You might get caught, you might be convicted, you might eventually face consequences. Alice's punishment was immediate and certain. Violate her rules and you'd face her fists the same day, in front of your peers, suffering pain and humiliation that would be remembered and discussed. This certainty made Alice's discipline more effective than legal sanctions at controlling behavior within the gang. But Alice's violence wasn't limited to enforcing internal discipline. She also used it to defend the 40 Elephants' territory and operations against male criminals who tried to interfere. London's criminal underworld in the early 20th century was divided into territories controlled by various gangs, with complex arrangements about who could operate where and who owed tribute to whom. Some male gang leaders apparently believed that an all-female gang couldn't effectively defend its territory and tried to either take over the 40 Elephants' operations or demand excessive tribute that would have reduced the women's profits to unsustainable levels. Alice's response to these challenges was swift and violent. She personally confronted male gang leaders who tried to encroach on her territory, physically fighting them if necessary, demonstrating that she wouldn't be intimidated or controlled. Contemporary accounts describe at least one incident where Alice attacked a male gangster with her fists, breaking his nose and leaving him bleeding on a Southwark street, establishing through direct physical confrontation that challenging the 40 Elephants would be costly. This willingness to fight men, not just other women, but actual male criminals who were larger and stronger, was extraordinary for a woman of that era, and was central to Alice's ability to maintain her independence. The incident that perhaps best illustrates Alice's capacity for violence occurred in the mid-1920s, when a male gang tried to force the 40 Elephants to pay higher tribute and to accept male supervision of their operations. Alice responded by organizing a confrontation at a Southwark pub where both gangs gathered. According to accounts, Alice and several of her senior gang members entered the pub armed with various weapons. Not just Alice's diamond rings, but also razors, bottles, and other improvised weapons that women could carry without attracting police attention. What followed was a brawl that left several men seriously injured and that established definitively that the 40 Elephants would not accept male control. This incident had enormous significance beyond just the immediate confrontation. Alice had proven that women criminals could defend themselves against male criminals, that an all-female gang could maintain its independence through violence if necessary, that attempts to dominate or exploit the 40 Elephants would be met with physical resistance that made such attempts unprofitable. The message reverberated throughout London's underworld. The 40 Elephants under Alice Diamond were not to be trifled with, and anyone who challenged them would face consequences that outweighed any benefits that control over the gang might provide. Alice's reputation for violence also affected how police dealt with her. Police in early 20th century London were accustomed to using physical force to control criminals. Arrests often involved rough treatment, and suspects who resisted could expect to be beaten into submission. But Alice's reputation made even male police officers cautious about confronting her directly. They knew she would fight, knew she was strong and trained in street fighting, knew that arresting her would be difficult and potentially embarrassing if a woman managed to injure police officers during the arrest. This reputation created a psychological barrier that gave Alice some protection, even when police knew she was committing crimes. However, we should be careful not to romanticize or glorify Alice's violence. The people she hurt were real people who experienced real pain and real consequences. Some of her victims were other women, gang members who violated rules, rivals from other criminal organizations, people who simply got in her way. Being beaten by someone wearing heavy rings caused injuries that were painful, disfiguring, and sometimes permanent. Alice's violence maintained her power, but it did so by inflicting suffering on people who often had limited options and who were operating in environments where violence was common and escape was difficult. Alice's willingness to use violence also reveals something about the constraints she faced as a female crime boss. Male gang leaders could maintain authority through implicit threats, through reputation, through organizational hierarchies that were reinforced by broader social structures that gave men authority over women. Alice didn't have these advantages. She couldn't rely on social conventions about masculine authority to maintain control over her gang. She had to establish and maintain her authority through direct demonstration of her capacity for violence, through making absolutely clear that challenging her would result in immediate physical consequences. This requirement was exhausting and limiting. It meant Alice could never show weakness, could never back down from confrontations, could never rely on anything except her personal toughness to maintain her position. The diamond rings themselves became legendary in London's underworld, symbols of Alice's particular brand of femininity as weapon. They represented the fundamental contradiction of her position. She was performing femininity through jewelry and fashion, while simultaneously weaponizing that femininity, transforming symbols of ornamental womanhood into instruments of violence and control. This contradiction was central to Alice's success. She could operate in feminine spaces like department stores because she looked like a woman, but she could dominate criminal spaces because she fought like a man. The rings embodied this duality, beautiful and brutal simultaneously. By the mid-1920s, Alice Diamond had established herself as one of London's most feared criminals regardless of gender. Men who challenged her did so at their peril. Women who betrayed her faced consequences that made prison seem preferable. Police who tried to arrest her knew they faced a difficult and potentially dangerous confrontation. The Iron Queen, as some called her, ruled the 40 Elephants through a combination of strategic intelligence and physical intimidation. Through her ability to plan sophisticated thefts and her willingness to personally enforce discipline through violence. She'd proven that a woman from Southwark's slums could command respect and obedience in London's criminal underworld, but she'd done so by making herself harder, meaner, more ruthlessly violent than almost anyone else operating in that violent environment. The crown she wore was made of diamonds and blood, and she'd paid for it through decades of fights and beatings and demonstrations of toughness that left her body scarred and her reputation terrifying. The Queen reigned supreme, but maintaining that reign required constant vigilance and constant willingness to use the violence that had created her power in the first place. One of the most fascinating aspects of Alice Diamond and the 40 Elephants was how they used their criminal proceeds not just for survival, but for conspicuous consumption that challenged and mocked the class barriers that had constrained them since birth. Understanding this dimension of their activities reveals that their criminality wasn't just about acquiring money, but was also a form of social rebellion, a way of accessing experiences and status that legitimate society insisted working-class women could never have. Alice and her gang were engaged in a kind of class warfare conducted through fashion, luxury, and the aggressive display of wealth that shouldn't have been theirs. After successful operations, particularly large ones that generated thousands of pounds in proceeds, Alice would organize celebrations that were deliberately extravagant. The gang would rent expensive hotel suites in the West End, sometimes at the very hotels where wealthy women they'd stolen from might be staying. They'd hire chauffeur-driven cars, arriving at restaurants and nightclubs with the kind of style that announced wealth and status. They'd wear expensive clothing, jewelry, furs, some of it stolen, some purchased with criminal proceeds, creating presentations of themselves as wealthy, sophisticated women rather than as the working-class criminals they actually were. These displays weren't just about enjoying luxury, but were carefully constructed performances designed to demonstrate that class barriers could be crossed, that women from Southwark slums could operate in spaces reserved for society ladies, that wealth and style weren't inherent to the upper classes, but could be acquired and performed by anyone who had the money and audacity to do so. Alice was making an argument through fashion and consumption. The argument that the difference between rich and poor wasn't about worth or capability, but was purely about resources, and that once you had resources, regardless of how you acquired them, all the spaces and experiences that society reserved for the wealthy became accessible. The restaurants and nightclubs the gang frequented were expensive establishments in the West End and Mayfair, places where working-class women would normally only enter as servants, if they entered at all. Alice and her gang members would arrive dressed expensively, would order champagne and expensive food, would tip generously to ensure good service and to create relationships with staff who might provide valuable intelligence about wealthy customers. The performance of wealth and sophistication was so convincing that other patrons and even staff often didn't realize they were serving criminals. They saw well-dressed women who appeared to be society ladies or wealthy mistresses, not recognizing that these women's wealth came from systematic theft. The psychological dimension of these performances was complex. For Alice and her gang members, occupying these spaces wasn't just pleasurable, but was validating. It proved to themselves that they could pass in wealthy society, that they could perform upper-class femininity convincingly enough to be accepted in contexts where their true backgrounds would have made them unwelcome. It was a form of revenge against the social system that had denied them opportunities, a way of demonstrating through action that they were as good as women born to wealth, and that the barriers keeping working-class women in their place were artificial and penetrable. But these displays also served practical criminal purposes. By appearing in wealthy spaces, Alice and her gang members could observe how wealthy women actually dressed and behaved, could study the authentic performances of upper-class femininity that they needed to imitate when conducting shoplifting operations. They could make connections with people who might be useful, waiters who could identify wealthy customers' homes and habits, taxi drivers who could provide transportation for operations, hotel staff who might provide information about wealthy guests staying at hotels. The social activities were simultaneously pleasure and business, celebrations and reconnaissance missions. Alice herself became a figure of fascination in certain London circles, where the respectable world and the criminal underworld overlapped. Some people, particularly men from wealthy backgrounds who found conventional society boring, were intrigued by the idea of a criminal queen, a woman who'd built an empire through theft and violence. Alice apparently cultivated these connections carefully, using her notoriety as a form of social capital, while being careful not to reveal information that could be used against her or her organization. She was performing multiple versions of herself: the violent gang leader, the sophisticated criminal mastermind, the working-class woman made good through crime, the glamorous outlaw. The fashion that Alice and her gang members favored was deliberately attention-grabbing. They wore the latest styles, often adopting fashions before they became mainstream, demonstrating their awareness of trends and their financial ability to acquire new styles immediately. They wore expensive jewelry, not just Alice's diamond rings, but necklaces, bracelets, brooches, often pieces they'd stolen, but sometimes pieces purchased with proceeds from other thefts. They wore furs, even in relatively mild weather, displaying these expensive garments as symbols of status and success. The overall effect was to create maximum visibility, while simultaneously creating confusion about who they actually were. Were they wealthy? Criminal? Both? The ambiguity was strategic. This emphasis on glamour and display created some tensions within the gang. Some members embraced the lifestyle enthusiastically, enjoying the luxury and the validation that came from occupying wealthy spaces. Others were more uncomfortable, feeling that the displays attracted unnecessary attention from police and from rival criminals, that the emphasis on celebration diverted resources from more practical concerns, that Alice's need to demonstrate her success was creating vulnerabilities. Alice apparently addressed these tensions by maintaining strict rules about what could be displayed when and where. Gang members could be glamorous during controlled celebrations, but had to be discreet during operations and in their daily lives. The cars that Alice hired or sometimes purchased with criminal proceeds were particularly significant symbols. Early 20th century automobiles were expensive luxury items that announced wealth and modernity. Most working-class Londoners had never ridden in private cars, relied on public transportation, or walking for mobility. Alice and her gang members' use of chauffeured cars was a dramatic statement about their success, allowing them to arrive at locations with style that working-class women couldn't normally command. The cars were also practical. They provided fast transportation for operations and escapes. They allowed gang members to cover large distances quickly. They created mobile platforms for conducting business. But the luxury lifestyle also created exactly the vulnerabilities that some gang members worried about. Police began noticing working-class women who were spending money in ways that seemed inconsistent with legitimate earnings. They started surveilling gang members who frequented expensive establishments, following them from hotels to shops to meeting places. The very visibility that Alice sought, the dramatic demonstrations of success that challenged class barriers, also made the gang easier to track and investigate. The glamour that was intended to demonstrate invincibility was becoming a weakness that authorities could exploit. Alice's response was typically defiant. Rather than becoming more discreet, she doubled down on visibility, apparently believing that confidence and audacity were protective, that acting like someone who had every right to wealth and luxury would create a presumption of legitimacy that would make authorities hesitate. This was partially effective. Police who encountered well-dressed women in expensive settings sometimes didn't suspect criminal activity because the performance of wealth was so convincing. But it was also increasingly risky, as police developed more sophisticated investigative techniques and as Alice's very success made her a priority target. The lifestyle also created financial pressures. Maintaining appearances required constant expenditure: clothing, jewelry, hotels, cars, restaurants, tips, bribes. While the gang's operations generated substantial income, the consumption was also substantial. Alice had to ensure that theft operations continued successfully and frequently enough to fund both the operational needs of the gang, paying members, buying equipment, bribing officials, and the lifestyle expenses that were central to her conception of what criminal success should look like. The pressure to maintain income created pressure to take risks, to conduct more operations, to target more valuable merchandise, which increased the likelihood of eventually being caught. By the mid-1920s, Alice Diamond and the 40 Elephants had created a distinctive subculture within London's criminal underworld. Female criminals who were simultaneously working class and glamorous, sophisticated and violent. Successful thieves and successful performers of wealthy femininity. They'd proven that women from slums could occupy spaces and access experiences that society reserved for their social superiors. They'd demonstrated that class barriers could be crossed through crime and performance, that the wealth and style that supposedly marked inherent superiority could be acquired by anyone clever and bold enough to steal it. But they'd also attracted the kind of attention from authorities that would eventually become unsustainable. The glamour was intoxicating. The excess was thrilling. The rebellion against class constraints was satisfying. But the visibility that made all of this meaningful was also making the entire enterprise vulnerable in ways that would soon become catastrophically clear. The Queen and her court lived like royalty. But empires built on theft and performance were inherently unstable, and the very success that Alice celebrated so conspicuously was creating the conditions for the empire's eventual fall. The 40 Elephants' success under Alice Diamond's leadership depended not just on sophisticated theft techniques and violent enforcement of discipline, but also on a complex network of corruption that compromised law enforcement, judicial proceedings, and commercial operations. Understanding this corruption reveals how criminal organizations actually function in practice, not as isolated outlaws constantly evading capture, but as integrated parts of broader social systems where legal and illegal economies intersect, where officials can be compromised, and where enough money can buy enough cooperation to make long-term criminal enterprise sustainable. Alice understood from early in her criminal career that maintaining successful operations required more than just evading police. It required actively managing the relationship with law enforcement and with other authorities who could facilitate or obstruct criminal activities. This management involved a combination of bribery, intimidation, strategic information sharing, and careful cultivation of relationships with officials who could be useful. The result was a web of corruption that protected the 40 Elephants while compromising the integrity of institutions that were supposed to suppress crime. Police corruption was central to Alice's protective network. Early 20th century British police forces were notoriously underpaid, creating incentives for corruption that many officers couldn't resist. Beat constables earned wages that barely supported families, faced dangerous working conditions, and received minimal job security. For these officers, bribes from criminals represented significant supplementary income that could make the difference between poverty and modest comfort. Alice exploited this vulnerability systematically, identifying officers who patrolled areas where the gang operated and offering them regular payments in exchange for warnings about investigations, for ignoring certain criminal activities, and for providing intelligence about police operations. The relationships Alice developed with corrupt police weren't simple one-time transactions, but were ongoing arrangements that required careful management. She'd provide regular payments to officers on her payroll, creating financial dependencies that made them reluctant to stop cooperating. She'd occasionally provide information about other criminals, rivals, or people whose activities threatened the 40 Elephants, allowing her corrupted officers to make arrests that enhanced their professional reputations, while simultaneously eliminating Alice's competition. This strategic use of information made Alice valuable to corrupt officers, ensured that they benefited from the relationship beyond just financial payments, and created incentives for them to protect her operations. Alice also understood that different levels of police hierarchy required different approaches. Beat constables could be bribed with relatively small regular payments. Sergeants and inspectors required larger sums, but could provide more valuable protection. They could ensure that investigations were misdirected, that evidence disappeared, that charges were dropped or reduced. Senior officers were more difficult to corrupt, but potentially more valuable. A superintendent who could be compromised might protect entire operations rather than just individual incidents. The corruption extended beyond police to include court officials, particularly clerks who had access to information about upcoming trials, about evidence that prosecution intended to present, about weaknesses in cases that defense lawyers could exploit. Alice paid for this information regularly, allowing her lawyers to prepare more effectively, to know exactly what prosecution would argue, to develop counter-strategies that prosecutors didn't expect. This advanced knowledge significantly improved outcomes when gang members were arrested and tried. Charges were more likely to be dismissed, convictions were less likely. And when convictions did occur, sentences were often lighter than they otherwise would have been. Alice also maintained relationships with several lawyers who specialized in defending criminals and who weren't particularly concerned about their clients' guilt or innocence. These lawyers were skilled at exploiting technicalities, at challenging evidence, at creating reasonable doubt where none should exist. They were expensive. Alice paid them substantial retainers, ensuring their availability when needed. But they were worth the expense, because they significantly reduced the consequences when gang members were caught. Even when conviction was inevitable, these lawyers could negotiate plea bargains that resulted in shorter sentences, could delay proceedings, allowing witnesses' memories to fade, could create complications that made prosecution's job harder. The network extended into commercial operations as well. Alice cultivated relationships with pawnbrokers and fences, merchants who bought stolen goods knowing they were stolen, and who resold them through legitimate channels. These relationships were mutually profitable. Alice's gang provided steady supplies of valuable merchandise, and the fences provided reliable markets that turned stolen goods into cash quickly. But these relationships also created dependencies and vulnerabilities. Fences who depended on the 40 elephants for merchandise had incentives to protect the operation, to warn Alice about police investigations of stolen goods markets, to provide intelligence about rival operations. Some department stores' own employees were compromised by Alice or her lieutenants. Shop assistants who earned minimal wages and who faced difficult working conditions could be bribed to provide information about security arrangements, about when valuable merchandise would be displayed, about when security would be minimal. Some employees actively facilitated thefts, turning away at crucial moments, creating distractions, even sometimes helping to conceal stolen goods. The sums involved were modest from Alice's perspective, but were significant to poorly paid employees, creating another layer of protection through corruption of the very institutions the gang was stealing from. Alice also apparently cultivated relationships with certain journalists who covered crime in London. These relationships served multiple purposes. Journalists could be sources of information about police investigations, about rival criminals, about political pressures affecting law enforcement priorities. They could also be influenced to write stories that shaped public perceptions of the 40 elephants, stories that emphasized the gang's glamour and daring, rather than their victims' suffering. Stories that made Alice seem like a Robin Hood figure, rather than a criminal predator. Stories that created sympathy or admiration that might translate into jury reluctance to convict if gang members were tried. The scale of this corruption network represented significant financial investment. Alice spent substantial portions of the gang's proceeds on bribes, on legal fees, on payments to informants and facilitators. This expenditure was necessary overhead, the cost of doing business in a criminal enterprise where sustainability required managing relationships with authorities who could shut down operations if they weren't compromised. But it also represented vulnerability, because the corruption network had to be maintained continuously. Stop making payments, and people would stop cooperating, might even become witnesses against the organization. Managing this corruption required Alice to develop skills beyond just criminal planning and violence. She had to assess trustworthiness, had to calibrate payment levels that were high enough to ensure cooperation, but not so high that they created unrealistic expectations, had to manage the psychological dimensions of corruption, where people who took bribes might feel guilty or fearful and need reassurance. She had to maintain records mentally. She couldn't write down who was being paid what, because such records would be devastating if discovered. So she had to remember complex webs of relationships and payments without documentary support. The corruption also created moral complexities for Alice and her organization. They were criminals exploiting other criminals. Police who took bribes were betraying their oaths, were allowing crime to continue that harmed innocent people, were corrupting institutions that society depended on for safety and justice. Alice might have rationalized this by arguing that the police were choosing to be corrupt, that she was simply taking advantage of corruption that already existed. But the reality was that her operations depended on and expanded corruption, made it more systematic and more damaging, compromised more people and more institutions than would have been compromised without her active efforts. By the mid-1920s, the corruption network that supported the 40 Elephants had become so extensive that it was almost an organization in itself. Dozens of police officers, court officials, lawyers, fences, journalists, and others whose activities and livelihoods were connected to and dependent on Alice's criminal empire. This network gave Alice enormous power. She could operate with relative impunity because so many people with official authority were compromised. But it also created systemic vulnerability because the network depended on continuous payment and continuous success. If the 40 Elephants' operations were disrupted significantly, if income declined, if Alice couldn't maintain payments, the whole network might collapse as compromised officials turned against her to protect themselves. Moreover, the corruption was creating political pressure that would eventually become unsustainable. Reform-minded politicians and police officials were becoming aware that organized crime in London was operating with suspicious impunity, that too many cases were being dismissed, that too many criminals seemed to have advanced knowledge of police operations. Investigations into police corruption were beginning. Internal affairs divisions were being established. Journalists who weren't compromised were writing exposés about criminal police collusion. The very success of Alice's corruption network was creating conditions that would eventually lead to its exposure and dismantling. Alice Diamond had built more than a criminal gang. She'd built a shadow governance system that paralleled legitimate authority, that compromised official institutions, that allowed her to operate with privileges and protections that should have been unavailable to criminals. This was an extraordinary achievement that demonstrated organizational genius and strategic thinking of the highest order. But it was also fundamentally unsustainable because it depended on continuous success, continuous payment, and continuous cooperation from people whose interests weren't truly aligned with Alice's. The empire of corruption that protected the Queen was magnificent in its complexity and effectiveness. But empires built on bribes and betrayals are inherently unstable. And Alice's empire was approaching the point where its very success would trigger the forces that would bring it down. By the mid-1920s, Alice Diamond's position as the undisputed Queen of the 40 Elephants was facing challenges from multiple directions simultaneously. Success had made her wealthy and powerful, but it had also created enemies, jealousies, and pressures that threatened to undermine everything she'd built. Understanding these challenges reveals the inherent instability of criminal leadership and the specific vulnerabilities that came from being a woman in a position of power that men believed should be theirs. The first source of tension came from within the 40 Elephants themselves. As the organization grew more successful and more profitable, some younger gang members began questioning why Alice should receive the largest share of proceeds and exercise absolute authority over operations. These weren't entirely unreasonable questions. Alice's leadership had made the gang successful, but the actual thefts were conducted by other women who took the primary risks during operations. Why should Alice, who increasingly planned operations rather than conducting them herself, receive disproportionate rewards? Why shouldn't leadership be contested or rotated rather than being Alice's permanent possession? These questions were particularly pointed from younger gang members who joined during the organization's successful period and who hadn't experienced the less organized, less profitable operations that had preceded Alice's leadership. To them, the sophisticated operations and protective corruption networks seemed like natural features of the organization, rather than as specific achievements of Alice's strategic thinking and relationship management. They could see their own contributions, their risks during thefts, their skills at shoplifting, but couldn't easily see Alice's less visible contributions involving planning, corruption management, and strategic vision. Alice's response to internal challenges was characteristically violent. When she heard that certain gang members were questioning her authority or discussing possible alternatives to her leadership, she confronted them directly and physically, using her diamond rings and her superior fighting skills to deliver beatings that served as warnings to anyone else contemplating rebellion. These beatings were public, conducted in front of other gang members, designed to demonstrate that challenging Alice's authority was not just unsuccessful, but painful and humiliating. But violence alone couldn't fully resolve the underlying tensions. Some gang members accepted Alice's authority because they feared her physical retaliation. But fear-based loyalty is unstable. It lasts only as long as the person being feared maintains the capacity and willingness to inflict consequences. Alice was aging, was in her late 20s by the mid-1920s, and while still formidable, she couldn't necessarily dominate every younger woman physically. Moreover, fear-based loyalty doesn't prevent people from planning careful betrayals or from waiting for opportunities to undermine authority when circumstances are favorable. Alice tried to supplement violence with financial incentives, increasing payments to key gang members, giving bonuses for particularly successful operations, creating a tier system where the most loyal and capable women received disproportionate rewards. This approach was partially successful. It created financial stakeholders in the existing system who benefited from Alice's continued leadership. But it also created resentment among women who received smaller shares, who felt they were working as hard but benefiting less, who saw the financial inequality as unjust, regardless of the logic behind it. The second major source of pressure came from male criminals, who resented the 40 Elephants' success and who believed that women criminals shouldn't be operating independently. London's criminal underworld in the 1920s was organized around male gangs that controlled specific territories and specific types of criminal activity. The Elephant and Castle Boys technically had authority over the area where the 40 Elephants operated, and while they'd historically allowed the women's gang to operate with relative autonomy, the 40 Elephants' growing success was creating tensions. Some male gang leaders believed that the 40 Elephants should pay higher tribute, should accept male supervision of their operations, should essentially become subordinate to male authority, rather than continuing as an independent organization. These demands were partly financial. Male gangs wanted larger shares of the profits that the 40 Elephants were generating, but they were also about gender hierarchy and control. The existence of a successful all-female gang that operated independently challenged assumptions about masculine dominance in criminal enterprise, suggested that women could organize and lead effectively without male oversight, created examples that other women might follow. Alice's refusal to accept increased male control led to escalating confrontations during the mid-1920s. There were fights between 40 Elephants members and male gang members, incidents where male criminals tried to intimidate or rob women from Alice's organization, threats of violence against Alice herself. Some of these confrontations were resolved through negotiation. Alice would agree to make token payments or would share information about police activities that benefited male gangs, essentially buying peace through strategic cooperation. But other confrontations required violence, with Alice personally fighting male gang leaders to demonstrate that attempts to dominate the 40 Elephants would be physically resisted. The most serious confrontation apparently occurred in 1925, when a male gang attempted to forcibly take over the 40 Elephants' fencing operations, believing that controlling the market for stolen goods would effectively give them control over the women's criminal activities. Alice responded by organizing a coordinated attack on the male gang's headquarters in a Southwark pub. bringing a dozen of her most reliable fighters and conducting a battle that left several men hospitalized, and that established definitively that the 40 elephants would maintain their independence through violence if negotiation failed. But these confrontations with male criminals created their own problems. They attracted police attention to the gang, made Alice's operations more visible and more vulnerable to law enforcement intervention. They also consumed resources, money spent on weapons, on treating injuries, on bribing police to ignore violence, was money not available for other purposes. And they created cycles of retaliation, where each act of violence invited responses that required further violence, potentially spiraling into conflicts that could destroy all parties involved. The third source of pressure came from changing law enforcement strategies. By the mid-1920s, London police were developing more sophisticated approaches to combating organized crime. They were establishing specialized units focused on particular types of crime, including shoplifting rings like the 40 Elephants. They were using surveillance techniques more systematically, following suspects for extended periods to gather evidence about patterns of activity. They were developing better coordination between different police divisions, sharing information more effectively, conducting operations that involved multiple units working together. These improvements in police effectiveness meant that the corruption network that protected Alice's operations was becoming less reliable. Even corrupt officers couldn't always prevent investigations by specialized units they didn't control, couldn't suppress evidence that multiple divisions had gathered independently, couldn't protect criminals when political pressure demanded visible crackdowns on organized crime. The corruption that had been Alice's primary protection was becoming insufficient as policing modernized. Additionally, department stores were improving their own security. They were hiring professional store detectives, people trained specifically to identify shoplifters, to observe suspicious behavior, to gather evidence that could lead to prosecutions. They were installing better lighting, arranging displays to minimize blind spots, training staff to watch for suspicious activities. They were also beginning to share information between stores, creating networks where theft at one location would trigger alerts at other stores, making it harder for shoplifters to operate across multiple locations without being identified. The 40 Elephants were still successful. Their techniques were sophisticated enough that they continued to steal substantial amounts despite improved security. But the operations were becoming riskier. Success rates were declining slightly, and more gang members were being arrested, even if corruption often prevented convictions. The trend was unfavorable, suggesting that the golden age of shoplifting that Alice had exploited so successfully was beginning to end, as commercial and law enforcement institutions adapted to the techniques that had made gangs like hers so effective. Alice's response to these multiple pressures was to become more controlling and more violent, to tighten discipline within the gang, to crack down harshly on any sign of disloyalty or inadequate commitment. This approach maintained short-term control, but created resentment that would eventually manifest in betrayal. She also tried to expand operations into new areas, different cities, different types of theft, hoping that geographic diversification would reduce vulnerability if London operations became too dangerous. But expansion required trusting gang members to operate without her direct supervision, which created opportunities for embezzlement and for building independent power bases that might eventually challenge her authority. By late 1925, Alice Diamond was still the queen, still commanded her gang, still conducted successful operations. But she was increasingly aware that she was surrounded by threats. Disloyal gang members, hostile male criminals, improving police effectiveness, better store security. She was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, and every victory on one front seemed to create new vulnerabilities elsewhere. The empire she'd built was still standing, still profitable, still powerful. But its foundations were cracking under the combined weight of internal dissent external challenges, and institutional adaptation. The Queen still wore her diamond rings, still inspired fear and respect. But empires don't fall suddenly. They decay gradually, internal contradictions slowly undermining external strength, until a single crisis reveals that the apparently solid structure was already hollow. Alice's crisis was approaching, and when it came, the diamonds that had protected her for so long wouldn't be enough to save the empire they'd built. The beginning of the end for Alice Diamond's reign came not through a dramatic confrontation or a spectacular police raid, but through something far more mundane and far more devastating. Betrayal from within her own organization, coupled with changing social circumstances that made her kind of criminal enterprise increasingly unsustainable. Understanding how Alice's empire fell reveals important truths about the inherent instability of criminal organizations and the specific vulnerabilities of leadership based primarily on violence and intimidation, rather than on genuine loyalty or shared values. The specific incident that triggered Alice's downfall occurred in late 1925, during what should have been a routine operation. The 40 Elephants targeted a high-end department store in the West End, conducting a coordinated theft that should have netted thousands of pounds worth of merchandise. The operation followed Alice's standard planning. Reconnaissance had been conducted, roles had been assigned, escape routes had been identified. Corrupt police had been paid to ensure they'd be elsewhere when the theft occurred. Everything should have worked perfectly. Instead, the operation collapsed catastrophically. Store detectives were waiting for the gang members, knew exactly where and when they'd strike, arrested several women almost immediately as they attempted to conceal stolen goods. The escape routes that should have been clear were blocked by police who apparently knew the gang's plans in advance. The corrupt officers who should have provided protection were absent, either deliberately positioned elsewhere or genuinely unaware that an operation was planned for that day. Within an hour, 6 40 Elephants members were in custody, facing charges that would likely result in significant prison sentences. The immediate question was how police had known about the operation so precisely. Alice's first suspicion was that one of the gang members had betrayed them, had provided information to police in exchange for immunity or reduced charges for previous offenses. She began investigating furiously, interrogating gang members, trying to identify who might have talked and why. What she discovered was both surprising and devastating. The betrayal hadn't come from a single member, but from multiple sources, suggesting that discontent within the organization was more widespread than she'd realized. Some gang members had apparently become informants because they resented Alice's leadership and the disproportionate share of profits she took. Others had been approached by police who offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for information, and who made compelling arguments that cooperating was more rational than maintaining loyalty to an organization that might not be able to protect them as police tactics improved. Still others had apparently betrayed the gang simply because they saw opportunities to eliminate rivals or to position themselves for leadership if Alice's authority was undermined. The multiple sources of betrayal suggested that the loyalty Alice thought she'd secured through violence and payment was far more fragile than she'd believed. Alice's response was characteristically violent. She identified or suspected several women of being informants and personally administered brutal beatings intended both as punishment and as deterrence to others who might be considering similar betrayals. But this violence backfired. Instead of restoring discipline, it convinced additional gang members that Alice was becoming dangerously unstable, that the organization was deteriorating, that saving themselves by cooperating with police was rational self-preservation rather than betrayal. The violence that had built Alice's authority was now accelerating the collapse of that authority. The arrested gang members faced trial in early 1926. Normally, Alice's network of corrupt lawyers and officials would have ensured favorable outcomes, charges dismissed, evidence suppressed, light sentences if conviction was unavoidable. But this time was different. Reform efforts within London's police and judicial systems had gained momentum, partly in response to public frustration about organized crime operating with apparent impunity. Prosecutors were under pressure to secure convictions. Judges were less tolerant of obvious corruption or technical manipulation, and some of the corrupt officials Alice had relied on were themselves under investigation and unwilling to risk their careers by intervening too obviously. Several of the arrested women were convicted and received prison sentences of 12 to 18 months, unusually severe for shoplifting charges, but reflecting judicial determination to make examples that would deter organized retail theft. These convictions shocked Alice and the remaining gang members because they demonstrated that the protective corruption network was failing, that the system had adapted to make Alice's previous strategies less effective, that prison was now a genuine risk rather than an unlikely outcome that corruption could usually prevent. Alice herself was eventually arrested in mid-1926 on charges of assault. The specific incident involved her beating a suspected informant so severely that the woman required medical treatment, and the injuries were documented photographically. Normally, such incidents wouldn't lead to prosecution. Working-class women fighting each other wasn't something authorities cared much about. And Alice's corruption network should have ensured charges were never filed. But prosecutors apparently decided to use this assault charge as a vehicle for attacking Alice specifically, reasoning that even if they couldn't prove her involvement in theft operations, they could at least imprison her for documented violence. The trial became a sensation in London newspapers, which covered it extensively. The reporting portrayed Alice sometimes as a dangerous criminal who deserved harsh punishment, sometimes as a glamorous outlaw whose defiance of convention made her fascinating rather than simply condemnable. This sensational coverage served prosecution's interests by making the trial politically significant. Acquitting Alice after such public attention would have been embarrassing for authorities. The trial also revealed publicly for the first time the extent of the 40 Elephants' operations, the sophistication of their techniques, and Alice's central role in organizing decades of systematic theft. Alice was convicted and sentenced to 18 months in prison, a significant sentence that reflected both the severity of the assault and judicial determination to remove her from London's streets long enough to disrupt her organization. The conviction and imprisonment were devastating defeats. Alice had been arrested and tried before, but she'd always managed to avoid serious consequences through corruption or through lawyers' manipulation of legal proceedings. This time, the system had worked. She'd been convicted, sentenced, and was being sent to Holloway Prison, where she'd have no authority, no power, no ability to maintain control over her organization. The imprisonment was harsh. Holloway was not designed for comfort, but for punishment and deterrence. Prisoners lived in small cells, ate minimal food of poor quality, worked at tedious labor that accomplished little except keeping them occupied and demonstrating their powerlessness. Alice, who'd lived for years with relative luxury purchased through crime, was reduced to the same conditions as any other prisoner. No special treatment, no deference, no recognition of her status in the criminal underworld. The psychological impact was probably as harsh as the physical conditions. Alice's identity was built around power and dominance, and imprisonment stripped away all the power she'd accumulated. While Alice was imprisoned, the 40 Elephants continued operating, but without the coordination and discipline that her leadership had provided. Some members tried to maintain operations using Alice's methods, but they lacked her authority and her strategic vision. Others split off to form independent operations or joined other criminal organizations. Still others left crime entirely, recognizing that the golden age of shoplifting was ending as stores improved security and as police devoted more resources to combating organized retail theft. The organization that Alice had built into London's most effective criminal gang was fragmenting without her leadership. Male criminals moved quickly to assert control over the territory and operations that the 40 Elephants had dominated. Without Alice to resist, the remaining women's gang members found themselves forced to accept male supervision, to pay higher tribute, to operate as auxiliaries of male gangs rather than as independent operators. The experiment in female-led criminal enterprise that Alice had championed was being reversed, with women criminals returning to subordinate roles that male criminals believed were appropriate. The stores that had been the 40 Elephants' primary targets also adapted. They shared information about Alice's techniques, trained staff more thoroughly on identifying shoplifting methods, improved store layouts to eliminate blind spots, hired more security personnel. Some stores even installed early alarm systems and cameras, new technologies that made theft more difficult and more risky. The vulnerability that Alice had exploited so successfully was closing, as retail institutions learned from their losses and invested in prevention. When Alice was released from prison in late 1927, she emerged into a changed world. Her organization was scattered, her authority was diminished. The corruption network she'd spent years building had largely dissolved as officials who'd been compromised distanced themselves from her. The stores she'd targeted had better security, police had better tactics. The younger women who'd once followed her leadership now saw her as a symbol of a fading era rather than as a current power. Alice Diamond was only 31 years old, still physically formidable, still mentally sharp, but the world had moved on while she was imprisoned, and the kind of criminal empire she'd built wasn't sustainable in the new environment. The fall from power was particularly devastating because Alice's identity was built so completely around dominance and control. For more than a decade, she'd been the queen, the woman no one dared challenge, the leader whose word was absolute law within her organization. Now she was just another former convict trying to survive in a world that had adapted specifically to prevent the kind of success she'd achieved. The diamonds on her fingers hadn't changed. They were still impressive, still potentially dangerous weapons, but they no longer carried the same meaning, no longer inspired the same fear and respect. The queen had fallen, and while she'd try to rebuild in the years to come, she'd never reclaim the absolute power she'd once exercised. The empire had crumbled. And Alice Diamond, the woman who'd built it through intelligence and ruthlessness and sheer force of will, would spend the rest of her life as a shadow of the formidable figure she'd once been. After her release from Holloway Prison in late 1927, Alice Diamond faced the challenge of rebuilding some semblance of her former power and influence in a world that had changed fundamentally during her imprisonment. Understanding her later years requires us to see them not as a simple decline, but as a complicated negotiation between her desire to maintain relevance and power, the changed circumstances that made her former strategies less viable, and the psychological difficulty of accepting diminished status after years of absolute dominance. Alice attempted initially to reassemble the 40 Elephants, to restore the organization that had made her famous and powerful. She contacted former gang members, tried to recruit new ones, planned operations using the techniques that had once been so effective. But she quickly discovered that circumstances had changed too much for simple restoration to be possible. Many of her former followers had moved on. Some had left crime entirely, some had joined other organizations, some had been imprisoned themselves, and some simply refused to return to an operation they believed was past its prime. The younger women Alice tried to recruit were different from the women she'd led in the early 1920s. They'd grown up hearing stories about Alice Diamond as a legendary figure, but legend and current reality are different things. They saw a woman in her early 30s who'd been imprisoned, whose organization had collapsed, who was trying to reclaim past glory rather than building something new and adapted to current conditions. They were respectful of her reputation, but skeptical about whether following her leadership was strategically wise. Some joined her operations, but many didn't, preferring other opportunities that seemed more promising. The operations Alice organized in the late 1920s and early 1930s were less successful than her earlier work. Store security had improved significantly during her imprisonment. The techniques that had once allowed 40 Elephants members to steal with near impunity now faced sophisticated countermeasures that made theft riskier and less profitable. Police tactics had evolved too, with better surveillance, better information sharing between divisions, and less tolerance for the kind of corruption that had once protected Alice's operations. The several operations Alice organized mostly succeeded, in the sense that merchandise was stolen, but the profit margins were lower, the risks were higher, and several operations resulted in arrests that Alice couldn't prevent through corruption. Alice recognized gradually that returning to active shoplifting operations wasn't sustainable, that her future had to involve different roles if she wanted to maintain any relevance in London's criminal economy. She shifted toward what we might call consulting and facilitation. She provided advice to younger criminals about how to plan operations, shared intelligence about store security and police activities, connected thieves with fences who would buy stolen goods, essentially operating as a broker and advisor rather than as an active criminal herself. This role generated less income than leading successful operations had, but it required less risk and less physical involvement, which suited Alice's circumstances as she aged and as her reputation exceeded her current capabilities. She also opened a small shop in South London, ostensibly selling used clothing and household goods, but actually serving as a front for fencing stolen merchandise. The shop provided legitimate cover for Alice's activities, gave her a physical space for conducting business, and generated some income both from legitimate sales and from the margins on fencing operations. The shop was never particularly successful as a legitimate business, but it served its purpose as a base for Alice's continued involvement in criminal enterprise. The corruption network that had once protected Alice's operations was difficult to maintain after her imprisonment. Some of the police officers she'd paid previously were no longer willing to risk their careers by associating with her. Her conviction and imprisonment had made her too visible, too notorious, too risky to protect. Others demanded higher payments, recognizing that Alice's reduced circumstances meant she had less leverage. Alice managed to maintain relationships with a few corrupt officers, but the network was a shadow of what it had once been, providing much less protection than she'd enjoyed during her prime. Alice's relationships with male criminals in London's underworld also changed after her imprisonment. During her prime, she'd commanded respect and some fear from male gang leaders who recognized her power and her willingness to defend it violently. After imprisonment, male criminals were less impressed. They'd seen that she could be defeated, that her organization could be broken, that she wasn't invulnerable. Some treated her with respect based on her historical reputation, but others treated her with contempt, seeing her as a woman who'd briefly achieved prominence, but who now should accept subordinate status, as was appropriate for females in criminal organizations. Alice resisted this subordination in ways both symbolic and practical. She continued wearing her diamond rings, continued presenting herself with style and dignity, continued insisting on respect even when her actual power didn't compel it. She got into occasional fights with criminals who disrespected her, using her rings to inflict injuries that reminded people that she was still dangerous, even if less powerful. These fights were Pyrrhic victories. Winning a fight didn't restore her former status, and the violence just reinforced perceptions that Alice was living in the past, fighting battles that no longer mattered. The 40 Elephants continued existing in various forms throughout the 1930s and beyond. but they never regained the organization and effectiveness that Alice's leadership had provided. Different women tried to lead the gang at different times, some with more success than others, but none built the kind of empire that Alice had created. The name 40 Elephants remained significant in London's criminal underworld, but it referred increasingly to a historical phenomenon rather than to a current threat. Alice was connected to these later iterations of the gang, but wasn't their leader. She was more like a respected elder stateswoman, whose advice might be sought, but whose authority wasn't absolute. Alice's personal life during these later years remains largely unknown. She never married, whether by choice or because her criminal lifestyle made conventional family life impossible, or because no man could accept a relationship with a woman as formidable and unconventional as Alice. She apparently maintained friendships with some former gang members and other criminals, relationships based on shared history and mutual understanding that outsiders couldn't replicate. But she was also increasingly isolated, living in a world that had moved past the era when she'd been powerful and relevant. The psychological toll of this decline must have been significant. Alice's identity had been built entirely around power, dominance, and success. She'd been the queen, the woman everyone feared and respected, the leader whose authority was absolute. Now she was a former criminal with a prison record, operating a marginal fencing business, providing occasional advice to younger criminals who saw her as a relic. The contrast between what she'd been and what she'd become would have been psychologically devastating for anyone, but particularly for someone whose entire sense of self was tied to dominance and success. Alice apparently never expressed regret about her criminal career, or about the choices that had led to her imprisonment and decline. She maintained to the end that she'd been justified in stealing from the wealthy, that class barriers that denied people like her legitimate opportunities made crime rational, that she'd built something remarkable, even if it couldn't last forever. This lack of regret might have been genuine conviction, or it might have been psychological defense. Admitting that her life's work had been misguided would have required acknowledging that everything she'd sacrificed and suffered had been for nothing, and that acknowledgement might have been unbearable. The London of the 1930s and 1940s was different from the London where Alice had built her criminal empire. World War II particularly changed British society in ways that affected criminal enterprise. Rationing created black markets, bombing created chaos. Social upheaval disrupted traditional patterns of law enforcement and criminal activity. Alice apparently survived the war years, maintaining her shop and her fencing operations, adapting to wartime conditions where stolen or black market goods were in high demand. But she was no longer a significant figure in organized crime, just one of many people operating on society's margins. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Alice was in her 50s, aging in ways that made continued involvement in active crime increasingly difficult. The physical toughness that had been central to her dominance was diminishing. She was still strong, still capable of defending herself, but no longer the formidable fighter she'd been in her 20s and 30s. Her reputation protected her to some degree. Younger criminals knew who she was and generally treated her with the respect due to someone who'd been historically significant. But reputation without current power is fragile protection. Alice Diamond died in 1952, apparently from illness, in relatively obscure circumstances. There was no dramatic ending, no final confrontation with police or rivals, no spectacular conclusion to match the spectacular success of her prime. She simply got sick and died, as people do. Her passing noted primarily by former gang members and by people in London's underworld who remembered when Alice Diamond had been the most feared woman in the city. The newspapers that had once covered her trials extensively gave her death minimal attention. She'd been out of the public eye for decades, and her death was just another former criminal's demise. Not particularly newsworthy, except as a reminder of past eras. The later years were a long, slow decline from the heights of power Alice had achieved in the early 1920s. She'd gone from absolute authority over dozens of women and substantial criminal operations to being a marginal figure operating a small fencing business. From being the queen to being a former queen, living on memories and diminished relevance. Some people might judge these later years as tragic, as evidence that crime doesn't pay, that power built through illegitimate means inevitably collapses. Others might see them as Alice having had her moment of glory, and then having to face ordinary mortality like everyone else. Either way, the later years demonstrated that even the most formidable people eventually face limitations of changing circumstances, of aging, of a world that moves on, regardless of individual desires to maintain past achievements. Alice Diamond had been extraordinary, but she ended as everyone ends, diminished by age and time, outlived by her reputation, but not by her actual power. More than 70 years after Alice Diamond's death in 1952, her story continues, resonating with audiences interested in crime history, women's history, and the complicated intersections between them. Understanding Alice's legacy requires us to examine both what her life actually demonstrated and what different people have wanted it to mean. Because legends are never just about historical facts, but about how those facts are interpreted, reinterpreted, and used to address contemporary concerns that the historical figures themselves never contemplated. Start with what Alice's life actually proved. She demonstrated conclusively that women in early 20th century Britain could organize sophisticated criminal enterprises, could lead effectively, could use violence strategically, could operate successfully in contexts that society insisted were exclusively masculine. The 40 elephants, under Alice's leadership, weren't just competent, but were exceptional, more organized, more sophisticated, and more successful than most male criminal gangs operating in the same era. This success challenged fundamental assumptions about gender that were pervasive in Alice's time and that persist in modified forms today. The specific techniques Alice pioneered or perfected, using feminine fashion for concealment, exploiting social expectations about women's behavior, creating all-female operations that could access spaces unavailable to male criminals, demonstrated that gender could be weaponized, that social conventions meant to constrain women could be exploited strategically by women who understood those conventions and who were willing to use them for criminal purposes. This insight has implications beyond crime. It suggests that any social convention creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited by people clever enough to recognize them and bold enough to act on that recognition. Alice's career also revealed the importance of corruption in enabling long-term criminal enterprise. She didn't succeed primarily through avoiding police, but through compromising police and other officials. Through building networks of corruption that protected operations and that bought time to operate successfully before law enforcement adapted. This reality complicates simple narratives about crime and law enforcement. Crime isn't just criminals versus police, but involves complex systems where legal and illegal economies intersect, where officials can be compromised, where money can buy protection that makes criminal enterprise sustainable. Understanding organized crime requires understanding corruption, and Alice's operations provide clear examples of how corruption functions in practice. The violence that was central to Alice's dominance raises difficult questions about women and aggression. Feminist interpretations of Alice's story sometimes celebrate her violence as empowering, as demonstrating that women can be as tough and as powerful as men, as breaking through limitations that society places on feminine behavior. But this celebration of violence is troubling. Alice hurt real people, inflicted real suffering, used violence not for self-defense, but for dominance and control. Celebrating her violence risks romanticizing brutality, risks suggesting that power achieved through hurting others is admirable, regardless of gender. A more nuanced understanding recognizes that Alice's violence was strategic response to specific circumstances. She operated in environments where power came through physical dominance, where being unable or unwilling to fight meant being victimized or controlled by others, where violence was the currency of respect and authority. She didn't create this violent environment, but adapted to it, using violence as effectively as male criminals did, but facing higher standards because she was female. This contextual understanding doesn't excuse the violence, but helps explain it. Helps us see Alice's choices as constrained by circumstances, rather than as freely chosen expressions of natural aggression. The class dimension of Alice's story is also significant. She was born into poverty that denied her legitimate opportunities for success, achievement, or even basic dignity. The wealth she stole came from stores serving rich customers, from people who had money to spend on luxuries, while people in Alice's class struggled for basic necessities. From this perspective, Alice's crimes were responses to systemic injustice, were ways of redistributing wealth that an unfair economic system concentrated among the already wealthy. This interpretation makes Alice a kind of folk hero, a Robin Hood figure stealing from the rich, even if she kept the proceeds for herself rather than giving them to the poor. But this interpretation requires ignoring inconvenient facts. The people Alice hurt weren't only wealthy elites, but included shop assistants and store clerks who lost jobs when thefts created inventory discrepancies, working-class women whom Alice beat for violating gang rules or challenging her authority, ordinary people who got caught in violence between criminal gangs. Alice wasn't robbing the rich to help the poor, but was robbing the rich to enrich herself and her organization. If her crimes had political dimensions or class warfare aspects, these were byproducts of self-interest rather than conscious revolutionary activity. The contemporary fascination with Alice Diamond reflects broader cultural interests in transgressive women, in female criminals who reject conventional feminine roles, in historical women who exercised power and agency in contexts where society denied them these capacities. Books, articles, even proposals for films and television series continue appearing, all trying to tell Alice's story in ways that make her relevant to contemporary audiences. This continued interest demonstrates that Alice's story speaks to perennial concerns about gender, power, class, and the price of defying social expectations. But we should be cautious about how we interpret and use Alice's story. Making her a straightforward feminist icon requires downplaying or ignoring the violence and harm she inflicted, requires focusing on her empowerment while ignoring others' suffering. Making her a straightforward villain requires ignoring the class barriers and gender constraints that limited her legitimate options, requires assuming that she freely chose crime, rather than seeing crime as rational response to circumstances that offered few other paths to power or success. The reality is more complicated. Alice was both victim and victimizer, both constrained by circumstances and responsible for her choices within those constraints, both admirable and deplorable, depending on which aspects of her life we emphasize. The 40 Elephants continued existing in various forms for decades after Alice's death, eventually transitioning from an all-female organization to mixed-gender operations, and eventually fading entirely as shoplifting techniques that had been cutting-edge in the 1920s became obsolete by the 1960s and 1970s. But the name remained significant in London's collective memory, symbolizing an era when organized crime operated with relative impunity, when police corruption was widespread, when the gap between rich and poor was visible and violent, when women who wanted power had to take it through criminal means, because legitimate means were closed to them. What lessons should contemporary audiences draw from Alice Diamond's life? Perhaps that gender limitations are socially constructed and can be challenged by people determined enough to reject them. But that challenging limitations through crime, rather than through political organizing or social reform, leads to individual success that doesn't create systemic change for others. Perhaps that power built on violence and corruption is inherently unstable. That empires created through illegitimate means eventually collapse when circumstances change, or when the violence and corruption that sustained them become unsustainable. Perhaps that working-class resentment of upper-class privilege is justified, but that expressing that resentment through individual theft, rather than through collective political action, doesn't address root causes of inequality. Or perhaps the lesson is simpler and sadder, that people born into circumstances that deny them dignity and opportunity sometimes respond by creating alternative paths to dignity and opportunity, even when those paths harm others. That we should understand these responses without necessarily endorsing them. That judging historical figures requires acknowledging both the constraints they faced and the choices they made within those constraints. Alice Diamond was a product of specific historical circumstances: Edwardian and interwar London, extreme class inequality, rigid gender roles, a criminal justice system that could be compromised through corruption. She responded to those circumstances with intelligence, courage, strategic thinking, and ruthless violence. She built an empire and then watched it collapse. She achieved power that almost no working-class woman of her era attained, and then lost that power to forces she couldn't control. The diamonds on her fingers symbolized everything about her. They were beautiful and brutal, ornamental and weaponized, symbols of feminine adornment transformed into tools of violence, jewelry that announced wealth while concealing deadly purpose. Alice Diamond transformed herself from a girl in Southwark slums into the Queen of London's underworld, proved that women could lead and fight and strategize as effectively as men, built an organization that operated successfully for years before circumstances and betrayals brought it down. She was extraordinary, complicated, violent, strategic, admirable, and terrible simultaneously. And her story remains fascinating precisely because it can't be reduced to simple judgments, because it forces us to think about gender and class and power and violence in ways that simple hero or villain narratives can't accommodate. The Queen is long dead, her empire dissolved, her diamonds scattered or lost, but her legend persists, challenging us still to think about what women can achieve when they reject limitations, about what prices are paid for power achieved through crime and violence, about how we should judge historical figures whose lives combined courage and cruelty, strategic genius and moral failure, extraordinary achievement and extraordinary harm. Alice Diamond lived and died, but the questions her life raises remain alive, remain urgent, remain as sharp and hard as the diamonds she wore on her fingers. Beautiful, dangerous, impossible to ignore.